Thank you so much, Kasia. Honorable ministers, representatives of UNFPA, old friends, scholars, and distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. As we've heard, demographic change in this region is a very complicated story. We have first countries of Central Asia that reflect a late stage of the demographic transition, still young, still with fertility rates above 3 births per woman, and with a lot of pressure to advance a demographic dividend. Now, fruitfully, for Central Asia, there are many other countries of the world that can offer experience and lessons about how best to promote reproductive health, reproductive rights, jobs, new educational opportunities, and to achieve those demographic dividends. But at the same time, most Eastern European countries that exhibit low and very low fertility, and in historic terms, this is very new territory for the world. I don't want to underestimate how new this is. At the scale of recent fertility decline, not only was unexpected, but it has really taken the world by surprise. Even 10 years ago, leading demographers, including the UN Population Division, estimated that there was really only about a 30% chance that the world population would peak before the end of this century. We were surely going to keep growing past 2100. But in 2024, those same experts radically revised their projections, radically revised them. In fact, they say there's now an 80% chance that the world population is going to peak before the end of the century and start to decline. What was the big difference? It was the scale and the pace of fertility decline. It was not expected at the level we are seeing. Already we have 63 countries and territories where the population has peaked and the population is on a downward trajectory. And this is not just true across Europe, but of course Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, elsewhere. And it includes some of the big populous countries of the world. China, look at their numbers. When you look ahead to what will happen in China, it's quite staggering. Russian Federation, Japan. And 18 of these countries are projected that in the next 30 years, their population will decline by more than 20%, and that includes Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the Republic of Moldova. And what I want to emphasize at the outset is that while researchers understand quite well how to help women and families avoid unwanted pregnancies, we are just beginning to untangle what we've created in a society that people are having fewer children than they want, or they want no more children. And how we can adapt to a world with fewer young people, more older people, a potential loss of labor supply, and a potential loss of culture, and yet at the same time prosper. And that's why I love the title, Leading Change. In my remarks this morning, I will encourage both new local research on these dynamics, but my goal is to focus and summarize for you some of the lessons that are emerging from countries that are on this trajectory. Now, populations grow or decline as a function of 3 things: fertility, mortality, and migration. But in the popular discourse, most of the time, the focus is on fertility. We ignore mortality, and we argue about migration. I'm from the United States, after all, and let me tell you, we are arguing about migration. But governments have remarkable power to influence each of these factors in ways that can strengthen demographic resilience. Policies that on one hand may foster some rebound in fertility or population size, but much more reliably can boost human capital, expand health and opportunities for people, and increase the capacity of countries to adapt and be resilient. Let's start with fertility. One of the phenomena that continues to be fascinating to me is this consistent interest in a 2-child family. Now, with the exception of Africa, this is an almost global phenomena. And it's sort of what doesn't matter whether you look at the gender and generation surveys or ECLAC or the Gallup polls, It aligns consistently with about that replacement level of 2.1. In Europe, it's 2.1 in Austria. I think in Moldova it was 2.7. The US poll recently was 2.7. Latin America, 2 children is the ideal. And yet, at the same time, more than half of all countries and territories have fertility levels that are below that. So what is happening? Where those gaps exist between the ideal family size, I will explain, I think 2 is best, but I'm only going to have 1. Where those gaps exist, it actually creates a remarkable opportunity for governments for concrete action. The first requirement is to understand what's holding people back. And this is an answerable question. We simply need more research. We've had surveys in Belarus. South Korea's done a remarkable amount of research. There's a new conference in Australia later this year that's going to focus on some of these questions. But I look forward to hearing from UNFPA later today to hear the first results from what I understand is a survey across 73 countries. Bravo to UNFPA on this, 11 in this region. This is exactly the kind of data we need to understand how to provide better for young people. Thomas Sobotka, let me say first, but at the same time, we do have intelligence about what doesn't work very well. Thomas Sobotka, some of you may know, and colleagues documented quite nicely that no single tax credit or one-time fiscal gift to a family, an incentive to have children, has hardly any impact on lasting fertility. It may lead people to have a child earlier than they had planned, but in terms of completed family size, it has very little impact at all. And we have powerful lessons on this. Do you know that the country, the Republic of South Korea, estimates that they have spent $270 billion over the last 20 years, $270 billion on cash and tax benefits with virtually no impact. We could talk more about Korea another time, but let me carry on. Likewise, restricting reproductive choices, like cutting public funds for contraception or undermining a work-life opportunity for women and trying to push women back into the home, these are counterproductive. For contraception is an essential tool for couples to time the formation of their family. Family life is challenging, timing matters, and what couples need is more flexibility, not less. Once governments understand the specific constellation of constraints on family life in their own society, then you can invoke a variety of responsive policies. These might include use it or lose it parental leave, more flexible working arrangements. I just read a piece that working from home options is now associated with more people in the US having a second child. Flexibility. Of course, everywhere we hear more and more affordable, high-quality childcare, but let us add to this care for older persons, which is a growing burden for many, many young families. We need to indeed promote a more equitable share of the care and household work between men and women. There's really good evidence on this. Where there's more shared work, the time to have a second or a third child is even shorter. Okay, so clearly the evidence supports this. And where young people are feeling pressed to prioritize their education and their earnings before they start a family, we need to pay attention to the need for reproductive technology, IVF, because they are pushing themselves up against the limit of the biological lifespan. And while every country's package is going to vary, the core goal is similar, and it echoes the principles from the 1994 International Conference on Population Development. Support people to have the number and the timing of children they want, and resist policies that seek to shift population size by restricting reproductive rights and choices. Now, turning to mortality, too often ignored. Improving life expectancy is actually quite a practical means to increase the size of your population. People live longer, there are more people in your country, so this is indeed a positive effect. And in the last decade of the 20th century, the last century, it was really better health and nutrition that had this huge impact on child survival, maternal health, with amazing gains in life expectancy. Global life expectancy is now about 73, and it's still increasing, largely because Africa is gaining. Stuart Gilbestian and his colleagues, many of you know, recently generated a quite interesting speculative paper with data from this region. And they asked the question, if countries in this region suddenly had the life expectancy of Albania, which has the highest life expectancy in this region, would overall population size increase by an amount comparable to if they instantly had a return to replacement fertility? And in their model, this was in fact true for 4 countries. Russian Federation, Moldova, Belarus, and Georgia. Why? Because those countries still have a lower life expectancy than Albania. Now, that is really a hypothetical model, but it reinforces a key point, that health investments are intimately connected to demographic dynamics, not only because they increase child survival, but because they sustain health into older ages. And health is the essential investment for strengthening human capital, achieving a demographic dividend in Central Asia, and for healthy aging everywhere. Better health enhances the productivity of adults at all ages and enables people to contribute at older ages to the labor force, still if they wish to provide intergenerational support to young families, and it helped preserve intergenerational transfer of cultural heritage. And for countries here that, of course, are in population decline, enabling and encouraging more people to contribute to the labor force is absolutely essential. And I very much appreciated this last speaker, Rita, and her point that she made on this. It's extremely important. I would say, ideally, this needs to move hand in hand with automation. Vietnam, Thailand, and are interesting countries and to watch what they're doing right now, anticipating this continued aging, decline in fertility. They offer some very good examples of combining deep investments in new technology skills at the same time with subsidies to industry for automation. Why? Because they want to adapt to a smaller labor force, but let it be a very modern labor force. And in a remarkable number of countries, it is women, the unskilled and underemployed, disabled persons and migrants that represent an untapped labor pool that is very policy responsive. In several countries in this region, female labor force participation remains low relative to men and to regional norms. For example, the regional average in the Western Balkans for women's labor force participation hovers around 50%, but that's about 18 points lower than the EU average. Training investments and retooling of the labor supply also provide a country with opportunities to upscale that labor force in digitization and the tech sectors. And the latest jobs report from the World Economic Forum highlights that rising global demand will be for technology-related skills, digital information systems, cloud computing, cybersecurity, AI, and not only to exploit those technologies, but also to regulate them. But targeted efforts are going to be needed if we want to have women in those sectors, because globally, women account for less than 30% of the workforce in all the high-growth, high-pay technology sectors like cloud computing or engineering. And frankly, it's where women dominate the economy in the clerical work or administrative support. Those are the jobs that are disappearing as we digitize the economy. So this is important, and this applies equally well to high fertility countries where job growth is a real criteria for the demographic dividend. Last, let me address migration, the topic on which there is so much global argument. Migration is not easy to predict, but the IOM urges us to acknowledge that migration is likely to increase due to climate and humanitarian crisis, but also due to economic inequality. Climate alone And pay attention, I hope, to the predictions for sea level rise and drought. They carry the risk of hundreds of millions of people needing to relocate by 2050, 2080. The estimates vary, but what I encourage you to look at them, because they're all extremely large in terms of the numbers of people in this world that will need to relocate. And given the need for labor in depopulating countries, governments should consider shifting away from restrictive immigration to policies that secure safe, orderly, and regular migration and provide a pathway to permanent residence. While such reforms may feel very difficult politically, the evidence suggests they will ultimately create a more resilient economy. Countries like Portugal, the Russian Federation again, Spain, it's immigration that is boosting fertility and population. Total fertility is low in both Germany and Canada, but it's migration that underpins the UN predictions that those populations are likely to remain relatively stable at their current numbers. Now, out-migration is indeed really a challenge. I know it's a big challenge in this area, and of course it's a driving factor for low fertility. And there is still much to gain from research on the push and pull factors that young people are experiencing. But expanding family-friendly policies, providing modern career opportunities, political opportunity, these are ways that one can try to promote circular migration, and there's some growing evidence of that, but it probably will need to be combined with more expansive labor in migration to be effective at securing the requisite labor force, a smaller labor force, more modern. Now, I understand that the potential inflow of migrants from other cultures leads to fears of cultural loss, values, arts, and language of families and people. But there are abundant examples for preserving cultural heritage. I'm a singer now, since I left UNFPA. I used to be a singer. I've gone back to singing, and I'm so impressed with Georgia's efforts to sustain polyphonic singing. If you don't know that music, it's amazing. Big efforts to record and capture this heritage. Estonia and Iceland have impressive examples for protecting language. Bhutan mandates that traditional dress is required in public institutions. And I was just reading about Slovenia's protection of traditional beekeeping. These are just a host of examples, a few, but there are so many ways to preserve cultural heritage. It is also worthwhile to recall that many advances in this world, in history, in medicine, in science, in the arts and culture, emerged out of places that hosted a complex population of culture, race, and religion. Think of Constantinople, Vilnius, Odessa, even Detroit, Michigan. And key features of those cities included universities for intellectual exchange, vibrant opportunities in the arts, and inclusion, because it's places of tolerance that attract talent, including young people. So to some, the demographic intelligence that we have to date encourages governments to do 5 things. Foster research on what young people want, what's constraining them in fertility, in family life, or promoting them to move away. Think of fertility policies as enabling packages, aiming only for people to enjoy the number of children they wish for. Invest in health and the care sector for both children and older people, and prepare for a digitized and inclusive economy, targeting the training for women and girls in the tech sector. And finally, reconsider migration, while taking active steps to both preserve culture and welcome new cultural communities. Thank you for your attention.